Welcome, everyone. This is Dean Sanjeev Kagram from the Thunderbird School of Global Management at the Arizona State University Enterprise. We're so honored and privileged to have all of you joining us. We're going to give everyone a second to log in. Please use the chat function at the bottom of your screen if you're on a computer or in your PDA off to the right, and to share your name, your location, your professional position, any connection to George Washington, our wonderful partner on this webinar, or Thunderbird and ASU. We'll give everyone a couple of seconds, a couple of minutes to join, and then we'll get started with this wonderful webinar on reckoning with systemic hazards. Nothing could be more on point in today's complicated, complex, exponentially complex world that we're living in. So just a couple of minutes. Please put your affiliate name and affiliation connections into the chat. Okay, welcome. Okay. All right. Looks like we are getting a great group here. Over 60 participants and growing. Fantastic folks. It's great to see our good friend Roland Coopers from Amsterdam and Joe from the Harvard Environmental Energy Law program. So many other friends and colleagues, partners, friends around the world. And we'll just give everyone a minute. Please do continue to introduce yourselves through the chat function, and then we're going to get started. Okay, let's get going. Again, I'm Sanjeev Kagram, the Dean and Director General of the Thunderbird School of Global Management, the #1 ranked school for global management internationally at Arizona State University Enterprise, which is #1 university for innovation, 6 years running, and most recently selected as the #1 university for the SDGs in the United States and 5th in the world. We first of all hope and pray that everyone is healthy and safe in every way with you and your loved ones, your community, friends and family. These are incredibly complex times that we're living in, dynamic, changing all the time. And for us at the school, our principles, we have 3 principles. It's to support and empower and enable the health, well-being, safety of all of our community. And for that, we mean our students, our faculty, our staff, our alumni, our partners, our community members from the local level here in Phoenix, and Arizona, as you know, which has experienced an incredible spike over the last 10, 20 days around the pandemic all over the world. The Thunderbird School is based in Phoenix, Arizona, along with Arizona State, but we have offices, centers in Washington, D.C. and Los Angeles, and 14 other places around the world, from Nairobi to Jakarta, Dubai, to soon in Sao Paulo and Mexico City. We're growing to 25. And our vision is a world of sustainable and equitable prosperity. And we are focused very much like a laser beam to empower and influence global leaders and leadership for the 4th Industrial Revolution. And in many ways, nothing has accelerated that 4th Industrial Revolution than the current pandemic in so many ways, including, us all engaging virtually all the time now. And so through the beginning, our second principle has very much been about continuing to achieve our mission in a digitally transformed world, in a world where we are remote, in a world where the pandemic, but also many other cascading and interacting challenges. It does seem that the country, the United States, and many countries around the world are on fire. I remember just 7 months ago, it seems like yesterday, I was in Australia with my partner, Diana Bowman, who's Australian, witnessing those horrific fires that we were all, that had captured the world's attention. And yet, 6 months later, in many ways, we've forgotten much of that because of all that has happened. Obviously, what's happening in the United States around racial injustice and the persistence of systemic racism in institutionalized forms in the police, but across the country, and what it's calling for in terms of a new level of equity and inclusion. But around the world, it seems that polarization and extremes have certainly taken ascendance. And yet we at the school, and I know our partners at George Washington, are committed to a world that comes together, that works together, new forms of collaboration and cooperation. So we have a fantastic panel. Let me introduce them first and then pass it over to my wonderful colleague, James Forster from the Institute for International Economic Policy at George Washington. So Anne Florini is a clinical professor here at Thunderbird. She really leads, along with our Professor Landy Signe, our brand new DC program, the Executive Masters of Global Affairs and Management. Her teaching and research focus on everything from the climate crisis to cross-sectoral collaborations involving business, government, civil society. She's had many wonderful positions all over the world, most recently in Singapore, but also at the University of Maryland, at Brookings. Most importantly for me, Anne is a brilliant scholar, a phenomenal, leader in global affairs, but just a wonderful human being with tremendous integrity and someone I always learn so much for. So we're so delighted to have her as part of the school and looking forward to this latest work that she's doing with Sunil. Let me then, and there will be dogs in the background, that's part of the new world that we live in. Sunil Sharma is a distinguishing visiting scholar at the Elliott School of International Affairs at the George Washington University and a senior associate at the Council on Economic Policies in Zurich, Switzerland. He was director at the IMF's research department from 2015 to 2018, which followed on a long distinguished history at the IMF, including chief of the IMF Institute as Asian Division, IMF's Institute's Asian Division in Washington, DC. He did his economics PhD, I believe, or he was on the economics faculty, at UCLA. So it's great to have you, Sunil. Welcome. And then James Forster is the Oliver T. Carr Professor of International Affairs and Professor of Economics at the George Washington University. He received his PhD at Cornell, has a distinguished career. Many of you have watched and listened and learned and been influenced by his incredible work on multidimensional poverty. Working with Sabine Eker and Kaushik Basu, of course. He's a research fellow at the Oxford Poverty and Human Development Initiative, among many other things. And of course, also the head of the Institute for International Economic Policy at George Washington. I'm gonna pass it over to James to make a few comments, opening comments, before we welcome Anne and Sunil to give an overview of the work they're doing on reckoning with systemic hazards. I think the last point I just make is that in today's world, for us, our third principle is very much about finding a transformative way to transform the world. We have to go beyond the sort of approaches of the past, whether that's in our daily interactions as human beings. As a former staff person of Archbishop Desmond Tutu at the Desmond Tutu Peace Center and dean of there, firmly believe in the principle of Ubuntu, that we are only a person to the extent that we are connected to other people, but all the way to the global level and the planetary level, when we think about the future of global governance and planetary governance, indeed, in today's complex world. So this is really very much in part of a range of webinars we have launched here in partnership with great institutions like GW to make a big difference in terms of not only thought leadership, but action in the world. So with that, without further ado, James, welcome. It's an honor and a privilege to have you with us. We look forward to having many, many, many more collaborations moving forward. James, welcome.
Thank you so much, Sanjeev. I'm really glad that the Institute for International Economic Policy, which I direct, the Elliott School of International Affairs of the George Washington University in Washington, DC, could co-sponsor this webinar with the Thunderbird School of Global Management at ASU. Students and faculty at the Elliott School study the big problems in international affairs. For example, my institute has 4 signature initiatives: global economic governance, ultra-poverty, climate change, and US-China economic relations, each of which has a multiplicity of dimensions that require multiple disciplinary perspectives, including economics, political science, history, and anthropology, in order to describe and address them. The multidimensional perspective is essential for understanding the interaction of countries in the global arena. I personally have spent a good portion of my academic life contributing to the measurement of poverty and income inequality, working with co-authors like Tony Shorrocks, Martya Sen, Kaushik Basu, and Sabina Alkar, and more recently have been focused on the implications of measurement for coordinating government policy and enhancing good governance. A concept like poverty is inherently multidimensional. So in response, we created the Global Multidimensional Poverty Index, or MPI, which appears each year in the UN's Human Development Report, and was the model for around 30 countries who now have national MPIs for coordinating public action and communicating results. I've been a little less successful in creating a framework for multidimensional inequality, but my institute is now presenting a new webinar series entitled Facing Inequality, which every other week brings together multiple disciplinary perspectives to understand the complex issue of inequality. So, for big problems, I view a multidimensional perspective, or should I say a systemic perspective, as being very important. I look forward with great interest to the presentation and discussion. Anne and Sunil.
James and Sanjeev, thank you both very much. And Sunil and I are deeply grateful to both institutions, which, as everyone has just heard, are probably the best institutions one can imagine to be dealing with this large question of how do you reckon with systemic hazards. We're arguing that COVID-19 has really forced an overdue reckoning with the world's ability to manage systemic hazards. It's brought home to everybody that you can't just wish away systemic risk. This is a lesson we actually should have learned in the financial crisis a decade ago. We're learning the lesson repeatedly, and we'll do so more and more, from the climate crisis. But what does it really mean to reckon with systemic hazards? How do you think about them? What do you do about them? That's the focus of the webinar today.
So when we started thinking about the problem of systemic fragilities, we thought that it would be helpful to think in terms of three interacting spheres. The first is the political realm, right? And here is how we manage and organize society to deal with common shared problems. Here we've seen polarization, including in leading democracies. We're seeing a lack of social trust. We are seeing stresses in the global order and rising tensions within many countries. The second sphere is the sort of economic and financial realm. While we've seen a reduction in global poverty, income and wealth inequality has soared within countries. And for many, the income increases has been, I would say, precarious at best. The other fact about the economic and financial sphere has been that we have, in some sense, not spent enough time on taking care of the environment. That there has been the use of fuels, the use of production processes, which have not, I should say, been environment friendly. The third sphere is the natural environment, in which our human systems are inherently intertwined, and we have not taken good care of the environment. So we're seeing a lot of climate volatility, ecosystem collapse, dead zone in oceans, massive heat waves, fires, floods, ecosystem stress. And it's the interaction of these spheres that we are really concerned with.
Okay. So what we want to do is spend just a couple of minutes on each of these spheres, fleshing out the problem a little bit more before we really get into thinking about how do you think about solutions? How do you think about the principles on which we need to be acting given the nature of the problems that we face? So if you look in the political turmoil category, remember the kind of public protests that Sanjeev just referenced that we're seeing around the world now. Well, we were seeing massive protests around the world last year. This one is actually from Chile in October in Santiago in 2019. And the protests there got so extreme that the big climate negotiations were forced to shift countries at the last minute because the government couldn't host a big international conference given what was happening on the streets. And this was happening in Hong Kong. This was happening in many different places. You've seen a massive loss of trust in all levels. There's a belief that elite preferences are what matter in governance, not what the broad public wants. And there's some pretty hard evidence that that is actually true in at least some countries, the countries that we've looked at. We have seen, partly as a result and partly as a cause, the rise of populism, extreme polarization in many parts of the world, particularly here in the United States. All of this really reflects a breakdown of trust. And if you look at the Edelman Trust Barometer, the annual survey of levels of trust around the world that came out in January, so that was before either COVID or the Black Lives Matters protests, it already showed historically low levels of trust in all sectors, not just in government or business or civil society. Everyone is doing badly. And on top of that, the global order that underpinned stability and prosperity for the last many decades seems to be rudderless and possibly disintegrating.
So let's look at the economic and financial realm. Now, one important lesson of the global financial crisis was that we need more systemic thinking. And this was in the context of the financial collapse. What we're now beginning to think is that that kind of thinking needs to be broadened much further to the economy as a whole. And in fact, in some sense, COVID-19 is really focusing the mind in that direction. Because COVID-19 is not a financial crisis per se. It's basically, first and foremost, a humanitarian and health crisis, which has fundamentally disrupted the labor market and has implications for economics, finance, for our social order, for our international order. And what we are trying to do effectively in trying to deal with the coronavirus is we're trying to put our economies in a temporary coma. Keep it functioning at a pace, at a slow pace, food, medicines, basic infrastructure, to contain the spread of the virus and prevent the health systems from being overwhelmed. But this has imposed tremendous costs on the public sector. Support for households, for firms to maintain employment and tide over lost revenues, to banks to support credit, maintain the financial plumbing, to markets to compensate for lack of liquidity, and subnational governments for loss of revenues. The reason why the response to the COVID-19 crisis, even in the developed countries, has been difficult, because effectively what we're trying to do is freeze a market system. Keep private contracts and market forces in abeyance until the economy is again reawakened. That's costly. More importantly, given the complications in terms of the interactions, given the uncertainties involved, the design of interventions is very, very difficult, because you don't want to distort incentives for firms and workers. You do not want to create zombie firms. And all this, in terms of designing interventions, has to be done so that there isn't corruption and cronyism apart from other systemic concerns. So what we're trying to do is basically wait it out, deal with the virus, and then produce an economic reawakening. But timing and expectations are important. Synchronization may or may not be possible, depending upon how not just countries, but different regions within countries, different states within countries are able to contain the virus. And this has implications for businesses, households, international trade, international supply chains. So what COVID-19 effectively is doing is basically, I would say, shining a bright light on cracks and vulnerabilities in every aspect of our political, economic systems. Inequalities are rising further. The gig economy has not done well during the pandemic. The burden is being borne by poor, low-wage employees, both in terms of income loss as well as in terms of risk of infection. We are facing credit losses, we are facing bankruptcies, and we need tremendous state and legal capacity to be able to deal with trying to put these market forces in abeyance. All this is happening at a time when we are undergoing a technological transformation. We're moving away from an industrial world to an information world, and this technological transformation itself is producing stresses in the way we organize our economic and financial systems.
Okay. And then we have the planetary upheaval that is underway. So just to visualize what is happening around the world, because a lot of this has gone on the back burner in the last few months. If you look at the picture of the globe, of course, every time you talk about environmental issues and ecosystems, people want to use pictures of the globe. But look at this one right in the middle. You see coming off the coast of Africa, this big brown smear. So this is a picture I got from NASA a couple of days ago. That is airborne sand, because there has been massive sandstorm going on in the Sahara Desert. And it shows you that is heading directly for the US. In fact, it's probably going to be hitting the US today. It gives you a sense of the degree to which the planetary systems are deeply, deeply interconnected. We forget about them. They're not on the human scale, they're on a larger scale. But we are disrupting those systems at the planetary level. Easier way for people to get their heads around is what Sanjeev was talking about at the beginning. The other photo is Australia several months ago. As Sanjeev was saying, he was there when it looked like this. Essentially, the country was on fire. And that is a fairly dramatic statement to be making.
So let's think in terms of the interaction of spheres. So when we started this project, we had a much narrower focus, but as we sort of got into it, it became clear that we needed a framework in which we could actually discuss all these spheres together and how they interact. Because trying to address any one particular sphere required inputs, required getting policies in the other spheres right. So let's just go through it very simply. So let's start with economic and the natural sphere. If we have rising inequality, if we have unstable income for a large portion of the population, and at the same time we have climate volatility and collapsing ecosystems, this is going to lead to much more divisive politics and less societal resilience. So here's economics plus the natural environment affecting the political environment. Let's start with the second interaction, which is focus on the economic sector and combine that with the political and the government sector. And here, if the focus is solely on profits, while the corporate sector doesn't focus on the environment and society at large, and at the same time we have weak government oversight, this is likely to worsen inequality and make the climate emergency worse, which in turn will damage the corporate and financial sectors and the political system. Similarly, if we think in terms of the climate crisis, and if it's not managed properly by dysfunctional governance, this is going to create an environment in which the economic and financial sectors are going to find it very difficult to operate with a large swathe of the planet becoming uninhabitable, workers migrating, and so on and so forth. So I think in some sense, when we think of risk to an economy or to our global order, we have to, in some sense, be thinking about all these spheres together and how they deeply interact with each other. And success in one cannot be guaranteed without having appropriate measures in the other spheres.
And so if you then start, those are the problems. you then start asking the question, okay, how do we think about this? How do we get our heads around it? A very useful way of thinking about it is that human systems and natural systems of the kind that we're talking about are complex. They're not complicated. And these are two different things. Complicated systems are one where you put the pieces together and you know how they're going to add up. It's a very mechanistic way of looking at problems. If you have a machine and a part goes bad, you swap in a new part. You know, you can basically tinker it into having a successful outcome. With a complex system, it's much more like a natural ecosystem. Many, many, many interacting parts of unbelievable levels of feedback mechanisms, et cetera, et cetera. It's not something where making a small change is going to have a predictably small impact. It might have no impact at all. It might have a huge impact. And I'm going to give you an example of what happens when you try to manage a complex system as though it's merely complicated, which we would argue is what we have been doing with the big systems, the human and natural systems, for many decades now, and we're beginning to reap the consequences of that wrong-headed mindset. And the example is forestry, and it's actually German scientific forestry going back to the late 1700s. And in those days, timber was a hugely important economic crop, and revenues from timber were extremely important to the state, which was then growing rapidly. And so scientific forestry management was about how do you maximize the timber output. Now, if you look at a natural forest, it's not maximized for anything. It is lots and lots of different pieces interacting in all sorts of ways. And it actually turns out that it requires all of those different pieces to create the soil, to have resilience in the system so that no one shock is going to wipe it out. But nobody knew that then. And so German forestry management got very, very good at maximizing timber. But the way they did this was they stripped out everything else. So they stripped out the underbrush, the other species that were not profitable. They replanted things in rows so that they would be easy to manage. And this was highly successful for close to a century, because it turned out that the system had enough built-in resilience that it could get through essentially one cycle of trees, because that takes about 80 years. And timber production soared and soared and soared until all of a sudden it started collapsing. When they tried to replant, it didn't work very well. And the reason it didn't work is because they had stripped out everything that made the system resilient. They had stripped out all the ways in which the soil is built. If you look under a forest, it's this incredibly complex network of roots and microbial species and fungal interactions connecting the roots so the trees are actually communicating with each other chemically. It's a very good example of how what looks to be highly efficient actually destroys the resilience on which you ultimately depend. And this is a fairly typical example. Coping with systemic hazards in these complex systems requires really significant changes in the way we think and the way we make decisions if we don't want to suffer the fate of collapsing forests. We have existing political systems that are pretty good, bureaucratic systems that are good with predictable problems that are based on known distributions. That's why we have that picture of a normal distribution up in the corner. They are good at applying rules that are developed through experience, analyses that rely on historical data. You can subdivide problems into little silos and have them dealt with. That's the way in which we have traditionally run everything. But now we're facing systemic hazards that are inherently unpredictable. The experience doesn't apply. Decision-making has to cross silos because no silo in government or business or anywhere else in society has enough information to understand the picture as a whole. We have systematically stripped out resilience because we call it redundancy and we call it inefficiency. And in these systems, there is a bewildering variety of feedback loops, path dependencies, time lags between cause and effect, tipping points. And the reality of these systemic hazards is that they are characterized by complexity, uncertainty. You really cannot know what is going to happen, and you cannot fully understand the situation that you're in. And ambiguity. Because of all the complexity and uncertainty, different people with different perspectives can look at the same data and see very different things.
So what we tried to do was to try and come up with principles to try and achieve resilience. So the first principle is robustness. And robustness means that you're able to take the initial impact of a shock. So in a sense, it's part and parcel of resilience. Resilience is much broader in the sense that not only can you survive the initial shock or shocks, but you can, in some sense, survive them and move on and create, and the system can continue functioning. So robustness, what we mean is that you want to try and make policy choices that are flexible enough to allow you to take advantages of opportunities that may arise in the future, and that they may not unduly constrain your future options. So again, here, you want to combine efficiency with buffers so that given the range of shocks you are subjected to, the system does not collapse. Multi-layered governance. Now, complex societies need both a integrated and a broad perspective. That means we need to be thinking both systemically, and at the same time, we need to be thinking in terms of the very minute ground realities simultaneously. So we want solutions that work at the whole of society levels. That means we have to think of the society as a complex system and make sure that solutions we're proposing work for society as a whole rather than for either certain segments or certain sectors. To do this, we need collaboration across the government. We need collaboration between the public, policymakers, experts, and other stakeholders regarding knowledge, experience, interpretation, concerns, and perspectives. In some sense, that leads us to the third. We want to empower self-organization. And what do we mean by that? What we mean by that is that it is almost impossible for central governments alone to possess the information as well as the capacity to deal with systemic fragilities that can manifest themselves in different ways in different places. I mean, think about the health crisis. If you're in a community and you know down the street the elderly who may need assistance given the COVID epidemic, if the community is robust enough, local community members will be able to provide that assistance without any formal organization. So when you try and scale that up at different levels, what empowerment means is that at each different levels, we can orchestrate the management as well as the response to a crisis, which of course also requires managing at, say, the federal and central levels. The fourth principle is communication. Now, as we are seeing during the pandemic, this is difficult, but it is crucial. It's very hard to agree on a set of policies or structural changes without some shared understanding of the nature of the complex problems we are facing. Public comprehension generates trust and collective ownership of decisions. And the last is, of course, and I think in many ways, very important, both in terms of the kinds of policies we pursue, as well as in terms of our institutional arrangements, and that is horizon scanning and scenario analysis. This is trying to discern signs of emerging problems that could cause systemic disruption. I think here leadership becomes absolutely crucial, because here what's
we're trying to do is we are saying there is no fire on the horizon. I mean, there's no smoke on the horizon. But if we do not take certain actions now, the system will become fragile and we could have a systemic breakdown. So we must organize our political systems, our societies in a way in which that we motivate our leaders to focus on prevention. Now, this is very, very difficult to do, like I said, because we never see the smoke before the fire emerges. And when we start seeing the fire, it tends to be too late.
So I'm going to quickly take you through one example of what it means to apply all of these principles. And it's going back to the Paris Agreement on climate change, which has been pilloried for being weak for the reasons, exactly the reasons that I think it's actually strong. It's called weak because it doesn't force anyone to do anything. But we had tried the model of get everyone agree that they're going to share pain in terms of cutting greenhouse gas emissions. We tried that for years and it utterly failed. And that was predictable because why should you sign up to commit yourself to sharing a degree of pain when you can hope other people will take it on? So here's the Paris model. It sets out a shared goal. Everyone agrees that we need to keep global warming below 2 degrees Celsius and preferably below 1.5 degrees Celsius, because we know we're going to have devastating consequences if we exceed that level of planetary fever. There actually are some requirements. The requirements are that you come in as a country with your plans for what you are going to do anyhow that is likely to have a positive impact on dealing with the climate problem. And the reason you can do this is because it turns out a lot of the stuff that you need to do to deal with the climate problem is also stuff you want to do for other reasons. For example, you want to shift to renewable energy and away from dirty fossil fuels because of the air pollution consequences of using fossil fuels. Well, if you want to improve agriculture because we're having declining soil productivity around the world, the agricultural practices that you do to sequester carbon in the soil are the same ones that you do to improve agriculture. What Paris does is by giving everyone a central focus, it prioritizes, yes, pay attention to these steps, it focuses, and it gets people thinking about, we want to do these things anyhow, we might as well do them in a climate-friendly way. So countries set out their nationally determined contributions. What they have to agree to do is, in addition to setting out what they say they're going to do, they have to report on whether in fact they are doing it. And then everyone comes back together every 5 years or so to do a global stock taking. And that stock taking says, here is where we now are on climate. This is the scientific development. These are the new technologies. How are we doing? What can we do better? How can we learn from each other? And it also takes advantage, in addition to the fact that there's a lot of climate action that you want to take for other reasons, Paris also takes advantage of the fact that global life is organized into a massive array of local, regional, transnational networks that have their own reasons for wanting to take climate action or related actions. So there's very strong mechanisms for engagement of cities and subnational actors, civil society, and the private sector. The outcome is that despite the current US administration's attitudes toward dealing with climate change and its rolling back of many regulations, the US is still within shouting distance of achieving its own climate commitments that were undertaken by the previous administration. And the report that we have a picture of up there on the slide has gone through many of the kinds of non-state actor commitments, cities and regions and businesses and civil society, to analyze what would they all add up to if they were fully implemented, all of these international transnational networks. And they are saying that if we did all of that, we would come very close to hitting the 2-degree target. We need to do more if we're going to get to 1.5 degrees. So the idea behind Paris is this is a different model for managing complex systems. It is not a command and control model. It is a model that recognizes complexity and recognizes the need to apply the kinds of principles that Sunil was just talking about. So to wrap all of this up, We have gone through, there's a set of fragile interacting systems in the world. The way we currently govern and manage those systems is stripping resilience out, not rebuilding it. We know we have to change the way we do things. We need a new set of principles for thinking about those things. We have to think of the 21st century as one in which we're having massive technological changes, as Sanjeev said at the beginning, a fourth industrial revolution that's changing the nature of economies and the nature of human interaction. We are seeing that power has flowed away from the traditional governors, but is not being replaced by structured institutions that we all have trust in. We're seeing massive shifting climate patterns. We're seeing massive social unrest. We're seeing rising inequality within countries. We're seeing great uncertainty regarding what are the jobs of the future, what's the social contract going to be, and we're beginning to recognize that we have no way of predicting the exact consequences of the systemic fragilities that we face.
So, given that we can't predict exactly how systemic fragilities will manifest themselves, in some sense, we have no option but to try and think in terms of resilience. And even in the case of the current pandemic, it is very hard to argue that we had not been warned. SARS, MERS, Ebola, there was a whole discussion of possible pandemics that could affect the world at large. And in fact, if you asked the CDC, their directors said that what kept them awake at night was the possibility of having something like the Spanish flu reoccur, because it hadn't reoccurred in 100 years. So it's very hard to argue that we were not warned. So the idea then is, how do we preempt? How do we reduce systemic risks preemptively? And of course, if we're dealing at a global level, it's going to require cooperation among countries. But what we've seen during the pandemic is that international cooperation is like market liquidity. It seems to disappear precisely at the time when it's most needed. So the question is, how do we make our international cooperation more resilient? What kind of systems do we need to have in place to make sure that when push comes to shove, countries will act in all our common interest? And we can think of this COVID-19 crisis as a societal stress test. And the lessons we learn from it will be very important for facing up to the looming climate crisis. With that, let me end.
Thank you so much, Anne and Sunil, for this tour de force. It's, I know I've learned a tremendous amount. I'm sure everyone who's participating has. We have some fantastic questions. I want to start by asking James if you wanted to ask a question, but then I could maybe also introduce maybe 2 or 3 questions at the same time, Anne and Sunil, so we can get the conversation going and get some of our participants engaged. So James, your question first.
Right, yes. Sunil, Anne, how do you think the interaction of the 3 spheres may be different for emerging markets, in less developed countries? And is the COVID-19 crisis likely to play out very differently there?
Yeah, thank you so much, James. I'm going to ask 2 more questions, and then we can go to you, Sunil and Anne. And I think, Sunil, you'll answer James' question, and I'm sure, Anne, you'll pick up from our audience here, participants. And Darius has been very active. Thank you, Darius. We love the energy of the series of questions. I'm actually going to combine 2 of them, and I'm going to pose this to both of you. But Anne, I know you have thought about this. Certainly, we've talked a lot about it. And it's this relationship between, there's a question about, do we need a global institution to manage systemic risks? Have we now got to a point where there are so many multiple systemic risks, and the patchwork that we have out there is not effective, and so therefore we need, as I think Darius is, I'm reading into your question, but I think it's a very powerful one, a single global institution, and then the earlier question that Darius asked is really, or will the networks and new forms of collaboration between incumbent institutions and new institutions be effective? Can they be effective in responding to systemic crises? So why don't we take those 2 questions as sort of that second combined. I'll go over to you first, Sunil, on emerging markets. I will say for us, as you know, at the Thunderbird School, Sunil, this is much of what we do in the world. We've been partnering across, for example, Africa, but every region with our alumni, 45,000 around the world and many partner institutions. You brought up the CDC here in the United States. You know, we've been working with the African CDC to create capacity and spread information on the pandemic. And of course, the resources, the abilities, you know, the will is there, the willingness is there, the incredible leadership and passion is there. The resources are just not there. So to you, Sunil, on emerging markets. And
so let's look at the interaction of these spheres. Think about what I said in terms of the challenges. What COVID has done is that we want to put economies in coma. Private contracts, relationship between private agents is trying to be held in abeyance. Market and legal forces cannot resume their work again. Given the complexity of the interconnectedness and the uncertainties involved, the nature and design of policy is difficult even for the advanced countries. How do you maintain the well-being of households and provide support to firms and intermediaries? Should contracts be renegotiated and possibly temporarily modified for the duration of the shutdown? How should targeted state interventions be designed? Does the state have the administrative capacity, the fiscal capacity? Is the legal system up to the task? Can society elicit the collective will to make shared sacrifices to sort of tide over the pandemic? Now, in EM and developing countries, the challenges are much more severe. I mean, think about it, crowded cities, weak health systems, and very large informal sectors. I mean, you see the pictures of Indian informal workers from the cities with children and belongings walking home because they hadn't thought about the logistics of how these people employed in the urban areas, when all of a sudden there was a shutdown, they lost their jobs, how would they find their way back to the villages? Externally, the emerging markets are facing what I would call the mother of all sudden stops in capital and resource flows. Capital outflows, especially portfolio flows, were dramatic, 100 billion in 6 weeks. They're slowly percolating back. The global response has been good. Dramatic fall in remittances back to the developing countries, breakdown of trade, disruption of international supply chains, and the collapse of commodity prices. So, and EMs themselves domestically are facing headwinds, restricted fiscal space, limited ability to do quantitative easing, since this could affect currencies and so on and so forth. Limited ability to borrow in local currency, high risk of debt distress, paucities of FX reserves in some of the emerging markets, prospects of an anemic global demand going forward in the next couple of years, and the shortening of global supply chains in response to the pandemic. Several EMs, we could have liquidity crisis turn into debt crisis. And it's all going to depend upon the speed of the global recovery. It's going to depend upon the second wave of the virus and how quickly the virus is contained and the vaccine is developed. The pandemic is a health crisis, which has the possibility of transforming into an economic crisis and then into a prolonged debt crisis. Now, success is going to depend upon three factors in whether you're in the developed countries or in the less developed countries, and that's going to depend upon state capacity, social trust in government, and effective leadership. I think the G20 is trying very hard to make sure that debt release is available to the less developed countries. And there is debt cancellation, debt restructuring. So resources have to be made available to the less developed countries. It's a global pandemic. If we cannot support Africa and Asia and Latin America in fighting the pandemic, we're not going to get rid of it. The last thing I want to mention is that EM and developing countries may face lasting scars from the COVID crisis. Less spending, higher debt burdens means lower spending on basic infrastructure, including health, education, erosion of human capital, and breakdown in trade and supply linkages. So for them, the magnitudes of the problem that we're dealing with are just on a different scale. And I think how large the global economy as a whole can remain under lockdown, or even individual countries, is going to determine how long this lasts, because we may not be able to synchronize the recovery.
Thank you so much, Sunil. And I'm going to pass over to you, but then I'm going to push you both to be shorter and tighter because we got a lot of great questions. We got to get everybody engaged. Okay, so to you, Anne, a global institution, global networks. You brought up the, sort of the Paris Agreement and the kind of new approach, the hybrid approach. How do you think about, this question? I think it's a really great one. Global institution on systemic risk. Kelly asked a kind of, sort of, what about the WHO and all of this? It's under heavy fire as a, so, okay, over to you, Anne.
Okay. So it depends on what you mean by institution. If you mean by institution an organization, which is what most people usually use it to mean, the idea of a single coherent organization that is supposed to deal with systemic risk in all these areas around the world, I cannot imagine how it would function or what use it would be. If you mean institution in the broader sense, if you think of the Paris Agreement itself as an institution, where you have a central focal point that allows people to come together and say, we agree on a general goal. And then you are bringing people together around that focal point. I don't think you can have a single one that deals with systemic risk because it's too abstract. But you can have a set of them that bring people together, but actively work to break the silos between the different issue areas. The problem with the formal intergovernmental organizations we currently have right now is that they are too disconnected. So the World Health Organization, it has internal problems of bureaucracy, and the question from Kelly Lee, she's probably better equipped to answer than I am. But it is not just a problem of how the organization functions internally. It is very much a question of what are the structures and incentives in place for the people who work in that organization to be working with people in other organizations that are dealing with other issues. That's why the Paris model is a good one, because it brings people together around in a common framework. It's a way of breaking down the silos.
Great. So we have a set of questions that I'm going to combine, which really have to do with the markets. Entrepreneurs, businesses, business leaders, markets, the private sector, if we could put in quotation marks, although that's been hybridized as everything else in this complex 21st century. Your tour de force, Anne and Sunil, really focused, sort of invoked the private sector and businesses and business leadership and new entrepreneurship. But the questions are really trying to push you further. What are their roles? How do they engage in this world? How do they create the resilience we need? How do they think about complexity and systems in their own, direct revenue generating and profit making side, but also in terms of shared prosperity and shared value? So maybe I'll go in reverse order and then back to Sunil.
Yeah. Okay, I will try to keep this short, but as you know, this is something I do a lot of work on. We have a problem with the business sector in that we have been incentivizing and rewarding the business sector to do all the things we don't want them doing. All this stripping out of resilience, this maximizing for one or two things. That's what a business model is set up to do. You take a basic accounting course. What are you supposed to do? You're supposed to maximize financial revenues, and everything is geared toward that. And it is measured in a relatively short time frame. And within business, what are you rewarded for? You are rewarded for your contribution to the bottom line. It's hard to align that set of interests regularly with broader public interests of the kinds that we've been talking about. So it can be done. And there are some very successful entrepreneurs who have set out to do this and have succeeded at scale in really solving social problems. But those are people who set out to do this, who had a purpose behind the nature of their business. The language you've been hearing for the last couple of years in the global business community has been increasingly about the need for purpose-driven business. And some of this is window dressing, some of this is real. And it's for several reasons. One is the more enlightened business leaders are saying, well, if we're stripping out all the resilience out of the natural systems, like if you're Coke and you're bottling and you need water to run your bottling plants and you're destroying the watershed, you're not going to have a business. And so Coke is now one of the leading forces in dealing with water around the world. But we may need to think a little more deeply than this, that we may need to think about how do you actually encourage development of business models that are for purpose as well as for profit. They have to be both. You don't have financial sustainability unless you also have financial performance. But if you can encourage much more of a for benefit, for purpose-driven approach to business, that's going to take changes in tax codes, in companies' laws, in how we teach and train people, because that's not primarily what gets taught in management schools or public policy schools. If we change the incentive structures and we allow people to bring their entire selves to the business world, not just their profit maximizing selves, then I think we have much greater opportunities to collaborate successfully on rebuilding a more resilient world.
Thank you so much. I'm going to go over to you, Sunil, and just complement the question I asked Anne. It's really the question of taking it right to your framework. We have the 5 principles, right? Including multi-layered governance and, sort of horizon scanning. The question that complements the one I asked Anne, which you could take, is, how can businesses, how can non-governmental actors actually, in some sense, internalize and utilize these first 5 principles? Or are they just at the system level? Is there a way that individual actors, particularly in the global business, private sector entrepreneurs, can internalize these principles?
So I mean, what we have to do is we obviously have to think systemically. So when we think systemically and you say, can we get financial resilience without getting economic resilience? And the answer has to be no. Because financial resilience itself is dependent upon healthy households, healthy firms, and a healthy government. So in that sense, we have to look at the system as a whole, which means that we may have to have more buffers going forward. Besides just buffers, and I think one way to think of it is say, is think about the role of technology. I mean, technology is going to be very, very important for humanity to face up to our systemic challenges. But then technology itself may be neutral, but it can create, it's a double-edged sword. It can create problems. I mean, think about the political and social sphere. It's led to connectedness, it's led to access of information, but at the same time, it's led to divisiveness. It's changed the media, the way the media is structured. It's forcing us to ask, what is the nature of truth? Now, that has led to all kinds of problems in terms of making political decision making. In the economic and financial sphere, we're going to have to think of course, technology has been the fundamental force for progress. But we are now dealing with the information economy. We're dealing with labor-saving technological progress. What do we need to do both in terms of changing corporate governance as well as rethinking the social contract? There's no getting away from that, you know, healthy workers, satisfied workers, workers who don't have to worry whether their kids are ill at home and have care are going to be more productive. And this cannot be just a societal issue that is being separated from the private sector. This has to be something that the private sector has to be involved in going forward. These are difficult structural issues. And I think that what we have to focus is not just on short-term stabilization, but we're going to be forced to think about much harder structural issues dealing with health, education, social security, and so on and so forth. And of course, in the environmental sphere, there's a huge amount that the private sector is going to contribute in terms of, again, technological development. How do we transition to a greener economy? And that transition is, again, going to be difficult, dealing with structural new fuels, new production processes, artificial intelligence, and this feeds back again to where are the jobs going to come from? How are we going to train workers to do those jobs? So I think the private sector is central to the systemic response to the challenges that we are facing.
Thank you so much, Sunil. So we're running to the end of our time. We'll go about 2 or 3 minutes over. We hope our participants can stay with us. 2 sets of questions, and I'll bring you in, James, after we go to Anil and Anne and Sunil to sort of wrap up, share your thoughts, and also you know, just our collaboration. There's sort of 2 strands. One has to do with the politics of this all, and in a world that you just brought up, where, you know, facts and science are contested, at the very least, one might say, where you have the world of you know, alternative facts and all the rest. On the one hand, where, as you said, and you know, local populations are rarely engaged in the way that it seemed like we are moving to even 5 or 10 years ago. There's a question about, how do we have evidence of elite capture? So it's about the politics of this all, and particularly, what fundamental ways can modern states really be able to rise to the occasion? How do they engage in this multi-level governance? So it's sort of the politics and governance, but particularly thinking about countries and nation states and the dynamics from the local to the national, in some sense, in the multi-layered governance, right? The second set is a sort of orthogonal but very similar, which is about ethics. And do we have the set of global ethics that can underpin this approach to the systemic hazards and systemic, and complexity? To what extent do we need, and as one of our questions, as social empathy. We've spoken a lot about compassion, but a big part of this is all of us getting out of our comfort zones and engaging in new ways, and perhaps with a new set of ethics and principles. So those are the kinds of two dimensions. And any final things? I guess I will say the last question, which goes back, there's a great, powerful question about building back better. Is building back better the sort of, new way of framing the SDGs and the decade of action? Is this, a plan or a roadmap for resilience?
Okay.
Sunil, and then go back to Anne, and then James will bring you in to make your final comments. I'm going to go to Sunil first, Anne. Sunil.
Let Anne go first. I think she.
Okay, Anne, please.
Okay. On all three of them, really great questions. On the politics, I saw that some of the questions were, will our political systems allow this? Well, the political systems allow what the citizens choose to have them allow. There isn't any getting away from the only way we are going to make changes at the system level is if the agents within that system, and it boils down to the individual citizens, choose to become engaged, choose to act, choose to become involved. And this actually relates very directly to the question on ethics and social empathy. One of the most positive things that I've seen in the last several weeks is, with all the protests that we've seen within the United States, there has been a very fundamental shift in what the polls show about white Americans' attitudes toward the experience of minorities within the United States. There is a dramatically increased awareness of how different the lives of our fellow citizens have been. And the fact that you can develop that kind of social empathy when people see for themselves how things are. It's part of the reason that Thunderbird has had always this very strong emphasis on global experience. When you engage with each other, when people see, most people are basically ethical human beings, quite capable of social empathy. We have to make sure that that capacity is what we choose to foster. And it is up to all of us as individuals and as citizens to engage in the politics and to help build that sense of social empathy. This isn't something that happens at the structural level. This is something that is built through through many interactions at many levels. I do want to get back to this question as my final point about how do you get this internalized, particularly within the business sector, because I think that's really fundamental. Part of it is we can change the incentives that we have the private sector face. There's a very interesting Dutch life sciences company called DSM that for several years, its senior management their bonuses are half dependent on their financial returns, but the other half is dependent on meeting sustainability targets. Does that influence their behavior? You bet it does. There is no reason every business in the world couldn't take on the same kind of thing. We know that there's massive work on developing environment, social, and governance metrics, so that why don't we have accounting systems that measure everybody as much on those metrics as we measure them on their financial returns? It's not one or the other. It's both. There are a number of ways in which we can flip the structures, but we also have to take responsibility as agents, as individuals.
Thank you so much, Anne. Sunil.
Let me just end with two, we're going over time, so two very brief comments. The first is that we as economists ignore culture. And I think that you can't legislate morality. This is something that has to be developed in society through our educational institutions, through our universities, and so on and so forth. So what citizens desire or what citizens aspire to see in society is not something which is external to society itself. We are it. We have to take responsibility for that. And as Anne said, and the second thing I wanted to say is that what the COVID-19 pandemic is pointing out, it is not the state versus the market. I mean, I think that that's a wrong way to frame the question. I think it has to be the state working with the private sector, with the markets, to produce the kind of society that we want, and that's perfectly, I think, possible within the political system to produce those incentives, as Anne was trying to argue.
Thank you so much, Sunil. James, I'm going to come to you, and I'm going to ask you one question that I know you're thinking about, we're all thinking about, but certainly I and you are thinking about, which is what is the responsibility of academic institutions in this complex systems world with all these systemic hazards and the kinds of principles that Anne and Sunil have shared. So back to you, James.
Well, that's a really interesting question. I think each of us has our speciality. Mine happens to be international affairs and economics and measurement. We need to bring to bear our own speciality and bring it to the party, if you will, and find a way of speaking across these barriers that have been set up over the years, barriers between you and me, different academics, different disciplinary histories and all of that. And also the barriers across us and people who are out there wondering what's going on. I think one of the most important themes that came through today was that measurement, setting forth particular quantities as having salience, is extremely important for two reasons. One, going across those silos, collaborating and communicating. And secondly, the kind of feedback systems behind governance. It's what makes things happen. And I exactly saw this happen with the MPI and the way governments are using a complex, if you will, multidimensional poverty measure, but not really that complex. It translates the complexity of the entire system into a few dimensions that are interrelated and we can attack right now. Okay, so I think that practicality is needed to be applied to this very, very difficult series of problems we face.
Thank you so much, James, both for that wisdom and insight, and also for your partnership. We really look forward to collaborating for a very long time with GW and your wonderful institute. Thank you all to our participants. It's been, as I said, a tour de force. We didn't get to everyone's questions. I apologize, but it's a vast topic. We will continue at Thunderbird, and I know it with George Washington and many other partners at ASU to advance these conversations, these dialogues. Let me then end by my own sort of evolving, because we're all learning in real time, and perhaps that's the greatest answer for us as academic institution. We have to become champions of dynamic learning at all levels again. And we have to, as higher education institutions, and I'm sure, James, we were talking a little bit about this before, be embracing the transformations that are happening and be leaders in that, so as to show the way that we can't just be stuck in our old ways of doing things, even in higher education, where we have been protected for very, very long. And the pandemic has shown that. Higher education is certainly in turbulence like every other sector, but we do believe that at Thunderbird and ASU, I know our colleagues at George Washington and many others, that this is an opportunity for us to really be transformative in order to be collaborators for a new transformational era. So thank you so much again, Anne and Sunil, for these incredibly powerful insights and in sort of prompts for all us to think about, from our organizations to the global scale. Please stay safe and healthy, everyone, in every way. Physically, of course, but also socially, mentally, emotionally, and psychologically, spiritually. Most importantly, be compassionate with yourselves and one another. We are frayed as a human community, and it's that type of compassion that we really need ever more than before in human history. So thank you again, Sunil, and thank you all the participants, James, our colleague and partner. Please stay safe and healthy. All the best.